Hello Reddit. I'm new to this online community and a bit nervous about sharing my story. But I feel it's time to open up about my life. My name is Alex32M, and I spent 10 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. Here's my story. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew each other. Life was simple, but I always dreamed of bigger things. After high school, I enrolled in a community college while working part-time at a local diner. Things were looking up. I was the first in my family to pursue higher education. Then, everything changed one fateful night. I was 22, enjoying a weekend at a friend's house party. The music was loud, and everyone was having a great time. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and found myself in the middle of a heated argument between two guys I didn't know well. One of them, Derek, was a known troublemaker. The other, Jake, was a friendly face I'd seen around but never really talked to. The argument escalated quickly. Suddenly, a fight broke out. Before I could react, Derek pulled out a knife and stabbed Jake. I froze in shock. People started screaming, and someone called the police. Derek fled the scene, and I found myself kneeling beside Jake, trying to stop the bleeding. The police arrived, and everything became a blur. Witnesses, in their panic, gave conflicting accounts. Derek was nowhere to be found, and with blood on my hands, I was arrested. Despite my protests, the police were convinced I was the attacker. The trial was a nightmare. The prosecution painted me as a violent man who snapped during an argument. My public defender was overworked and couldn't put up a strong defense. Key witnesses either couldn't be found or gave testimonies that didn't align with the truth. Derek, the real culprit, had vanished. Despite my innocence, I was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Prison was a harsh and unforgiving place. I struggled to adapt to the brutal environment, where survival often depended on aligning with the right groups. Despite the circumstances, I held on to my innocence and made a vow to prove it someday. I kept my head down, avoided trouble as much as possible, and focused on self-improvement. I spent countless hours in the library, studying law books, and writing letters to legal aid organizations, hoping someone would take up my case. My family visited as often as they could, but the strain was evident. My mom aged beyond her years, and my younger sister, Emily, grew up while I was behind bars. The hardest part was seeing their pain and knowing they couldn't fully move on while I was incarcerated. After 5 years, a breakthrough came. A young lawyer named Mia took an interest in my case. She was passionate, driven, and believed in my innocence. With her help, we began the arduous process of gathering new evidence and re-interviewing witnesses. It wasn't easy. Many people had moved on, and memories had faded. One day, a lead came through. A former acquaintance of Derek's reached out, willing to testify that Derek had confessed to the crime while drunk at a party years ago. This testimony, combined with new forensic evidence and discrepancies in the original witness statements, gave us hope. It took another year, but eventually, Mia managed to get my case reopened. The new evidence was compelling enough for a judge to grant me a new trial. This time, with Mia's dedicated representation and the fresh testimony, the truth finally came to light. Derek was found and arrested, and I was exonerated. Walking out of prison was surreal. I was 32, with a decade of my life stolen. My family was there, and we cried tears of joy and relief. But I knew the road to recovery would be long. Adjusting to life outside wasn't easy. Technology had advanced, and I felt like a stranger in my own hometown. Mia and I grew close during the fight for my freedom, and our relationship blossomed into something more. She was my rock, and together, we navigated the complexities of life after wrongful imprisonment. Thank you for reading my story. Sharing it here has been cathartic. If my experience can help even one person find the strength to fight for their truth, then it's worth it. Stay strong, and never give up on seeking justice. Hello Reddit. It's been a while since my last update, and I wanted to share more about my journey after being released from prison. For those who don't know, my name is Alex32M, and I spent 10 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. Here's a detailed account of my transition back to the outside world and the challenges I faced. Walking out of prison after a decade was surreal. I was 32, and the world had changed so much in my absence. I felt a mixture of relief, joy, and overwhelming anxiety about what lay ahead. My family was there to greet me, and while their support was a beacon of hope, I quickly realized that my battle was far from over. Despite being exonerated, many people in my hometown still believed I was guilty. The stigma of being a convicted murderer was hard to shake off, and whispers followed me wherever I went. The media coverage of my release had been extensive, but not everyone was convinced of my innocence. Some saw me as a criminal who got off on a technicality. Finding a job was one of the most significant hurdles. My resume had a 10-year gap, and I had no recent work experience. Many employers were hesitant to hire someone with my background, even after I explained my wrongful conviction. The skepticism was palpable in every interview. I lost count of how many times I saw a look of doubt or suspicion cross the faces of potential employers. One memorable interview was for a job at a local warehouse. The manager seemed friendly at first, but as soon as I mentioned my past, his demeanor changed. "We'll be in touch," he said, but I never heard back. It was a pattern that repeated over and over again. Living in my hometown was also challenging. I could feel the judgmental eyes of my neighbors whenever I stepped outside. Some people crossed the street to avoid me, and I heard the murmurs of gossip as I walked by. "There goes the murderer," they'd say, despite my exoneration. The weight of their suspicion was suffocating. Socially, it was equally difficult. Old friends had moved on, and many weren't sure how to interact with me. Invitations to gatherings were rare, and when I did attend, there was always an awkwardness in the air. People were afraid to ask about my time in prison but were clearly curious. The isolation was intense, and there were nights when I felt utterly alone. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping became a source of stress. I remember standing in line at the store, feeling the stares of other customers. Once, an elderly woman behind me whispered to her companion, "Isn't that the guy who killed someone?" The anger and frustration of constantly being judged for a crime I didn't commit were overwhelming. One of the few places I found solace was at a local nonprofit organization that helped wrongfully convicted individuals. They offered me a job, understanding my situation and the challenges I faced. It was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. Working there gave me a sense of purpose and allowed me to connect with others who had endured similar injustices. Mia, the lawyer who helped prove my innocence, continued to be a pillar of support. Our relationship grew stronger as we navigated these challenges together. She helped me find a therapist, and those sessions became a crucial part of my healing process. Talking through my experiences, both in prison and during my transition, was cathartic. Despite the support, there were days when I felt like giving up. The mental toll of constantly defending my innocence was exhausting. Depression and anxiety were my constant companions, and I struggled to find my footing in a world that had moved on without me. Over time, things began to improve, albeit slowly. The nonprofit work allowed me to build new relationships and regain some of the self-esteem prison had stripped away. I started attending support groups for wrongfully convicted individuals, where I met others who truly understood my pain and frustration. Gradually, I began to rebuild my life. I found hobbies that brought me joy, like painting and writing. These creative outlets became therapeutic, helping me process my emotions and experiences. Mia and I moved in together, creating a safe and loving home environment where I could heal. One day, I received a call from a local business owner who had read about my story and wanted to offer me a job. He believed in second chances and wanted to help me rebuild my life. It was a turning point that restored some of my faith in humanity. Despite the slow progress, I remained determined to advocate for others like me. I began speaking at schools and community centers, sharing my story and raising awareness about wrongful convictions. Each speech was a step toward healing and reclaiming my identity. Looking back, my transition to the outside world was one of the hardest things I've ever faced. The judgment, the mistrust, and the constant battle to prove my innocence took a toll on my mental health. But through it all, I found strength in my resilience, the support of my loved ones, and my determination to make a difference. Thank you for reading my story, Reddit. Sharing it here has been a crucial part of my healing journey. If my experiences can help even one person facing similar struggles, then it's all worth it. Stay strong, and never stop fighting for justice and the truth.